The title of my talk today is Racism, the Secret to My Success. Now, of course, I don't mean racism in practice. I'm sure nobody in here practices racism, right? And if you are practicing racism, we'd ask you, please stop practicing racism. Please stop. But actually what I want us to think is I want us to rethink how we respond to racism. By challenging racism, injustice, and oppression, I was able to find my life calling. I was born on the south side of Chicago, and my experience on the south side of Chicago was one that was 100% black. My family's 100% black. I know that might not be obvious. I'm a little light-skinned, so that's the case. My friends were 100% black. My neighbors were 100% black. My classmates were 100% black. So although my mother gave me the name Jasiri, Arande, which was an African name, and she, gave me heroes like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Fannie Lou Hamer and raised me socially conscious, I really didn't totally understand until halfway through my life, right around high school, she decided to move us from the south side of Chicago to Monroeville, Pennsylvania. You can see how excited I was to arrive in Monroeville, Pennsylvania. And I remember my first experience in Monroeville, the thing to do in Monroeville was go to Monroeville Mall, and we went to the Monroeville Mall, and as we were leaving, a drunk white man called us niggas. And I remember wondering how to respond to that moment and how do I protect my family. And so when I arrived at Gateway High School, I experienced a lot of racism and discrimination. And coming from the south side of Chicago, my thing was that if you're gonna say some racist things to my face, then we gonna fight. And so I remember when I got suspended that first time and I came home to talk to my mom. And, my mother, when my father left the house, my mother, who was working at the time, enrolled in Roosevelt University. She graduated as a valedictorian, and she moved us from Chicago to Monroeville because she got a job at Westinghouse Electric Corporation as a nuclear engineer. So for my mom, education was everything. So she made it very clear in that way that only a black mom can, that there would be no more fighting and getting suspended for me at Gateway High School. And so I had to come up with another way to kind of respond and deal with the racism that I was experiencing. And so I got together with some other students of color at Gateway, and we started a club called Our Cultures. And we also petitioned our school. At the time, we didn't have a Black History class, so we petitioned our school, and we got our school to teach its first Black History class, and I was off as an activist. And, my introduction to hip-hop was a little bit simpler. Like my best friend at the time, he got some turntables. He said, I'm gonna be the DJ, you be the rapper. And, but I remember my first rap was kind of about, the discrimination I was facing in my school, and it was terrible. But I continued to do it because for me, to be able to write about, my experiences were therapeutic for me. And so I kind of emerged then on the national scene as an activist. I would say locally, I emerged locally as an activist in 2006. And that was an interesting year because in 2006, Pittsburgh was given the distinction of being called America's most livable city. Even though that same year, according to the United States Census, we had the poorest working class black community in the country. And so we felt that they deserved a response, and so I got together with a group of young men. That's actually me in the middle in the suit. I know it's kind of hard. My suit was baggy. I was even hip-hop in a suit. And we started an organization called One Hood because what we saw happening in our community we felt was a state of emergency. We felt it was one that we had to deal with beyond religious lines, political lines, philosophical lines, racial lines. We felt like in order to really achieve what we needed to happen in our community, we needed to all come together to make Pittsburgh most livable for everybody. In that same year, I emerged as a hip-hop artist due to an incident that happened in a small town in Louisiana called Jena. Now, Jena was one of these towns in the South where the train tracks divide the places. And so on one side of the tracks was affluent white community. On the other side of the tracks was a poor black community. And at the high school in Jena, the unwritten rule was that only white students could sit underneath the tree in front of the school. And so a black student sat in front of the tree, and white students hung 3 nooses from the tree. Now, those students were suspended, but he created a lot of racial tension in the town. And so a black student was jumped by some white classmates at a party off campus, and the next day in school, some of his friends saw one of the guys that jumped him, and they jumped that person. But instead of getting suspended from school, they were charged with attempted murder, even though the young man that they beat up didn't spend the night in the hospital. And one of the young men, Michael Bell, was given a 10-year prison sentence. Now, this was the first time people began to kind of use social media to spread the word about what was going on in different communities across the country. I don't know if you all remember, there used to be this website called MySpace. I don't know if y'all remember MySpace. And so I heard about, the Jena Six on MySpace. And I remember, feeling like I wanted to do something. I wanted to respond. I wanted to get involved. And I didn't have money to give. And so I said, well, I want to tell this story. And so I wrote a song called Free the Jena Six, and I put it on my MySpace page. And somebody took the song, they sent it to a radio host named Michael Basin, who had the largest syndicated black radio show in the country and was in every major media market. Next thing I know, my song was being played all over the country. I ended up going to Jena along with 50,000 other people that were protesting to drop the charges against the Jena Six. Most of them were high school and college-age black students. And I was on stage with Al Sharpton and Dick Gregory and Ice Cube. And, the song became the theme to the movement. The charges were dropped against the Jena Six. Michael Bell was freed from prison, and we had a victory. And I saw how powerful art could be when it's connected to a social movement. And I saw how powerful we could be in unity when we respond to a situation of injustice. And so that's what I began to do with my platform and our career. As a hip-hop artist, I began to use my platform to respond to whether it was cases of police brutality, like what happened with Oscar Grant or Trayvon Martin, or whether it was movements that I would support with my music, like Occupy or the movement to save the life of Troy Davis. And so in 2010, another interesting movement had came up that was really a response to President Barack Obama being the first black president of the United States, and it was called the Tea Party. I don't know if you all remember the Tea Party, but the Tea Party to me seemed like a movement whose biggest problem was that the president was a black man. And they were organizing all these marches and rallies, and one of the rallies that they organized was that they actually had a march on the White House with their guns. So they got all the kind of gun owners and everybody to collect their guns, and they said, we're going to march on the White House with our guns. And I remember thinking to myself, just imagine if some black protesters were to come together and say, we're going to get a whole bunch of guns and we're going to march to the White House. How far do you think we would get? And so I did a song called What If the Tea Party Was Black? And put a video out, and that video went viral. The song was shared through different social medias, and it actually enabled me to be able to leave my job and be a full-time hip-hop artist. Thank you, crazy white people. I really do appreciate that one. In 2010, another thing happened actually right here in Pittsburgh. The Heinz Endowment and the Pew Center did a study of how the local media portrays black men. And what they found out was 90% of the time that the local media portrays black men, it's crime. That when it comes to quality of life stories about black men, that it was less than 3%. And so because we participated in this study, we went to Heinz and we said, myself and the other members of One Hood, we said we want to teach young black men how to analyze media and create media for ourselves. And so in 2010, we launched the One Hood Media Academy to create a place where students of color could come together, analyze media, most of which that was targeted us, highlight the most negative aspects of our community, but also to create media for ourselves so we could tell our own stories. In 2006, we celebrated our 10th anniversary as One Hood. This is how One Hood looks today. We're a collection of hip-hop artists, singers, activists, bloggers, photographers, videographers, and our goal is to use our talents and gifts to not only respond to the most negative portrayals. Oftentimes the dominant media portrayal of young people of color is negative, but also to be able to use our resources to share our own stories. As a hip-hop artist, I've also grown. In 2017, I was able to perform to my largest crowd at the Women's March on Washington. That was also a response to not just this administration, but also the marginalization of women. It was led by 3 women of color. I was able to perform with another hip-hop artist named My Son and a poet named Aja Monet. The crowd estimated was 750 to 1 million people. Sadly, a few weeks after that, my mother passed away. The day she died, I was doing my life's purpose. I was performing at a rally in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to save healthcare, where they expected 1,000 people to show up and 5,000 people responded. What I was most proud of while my mother was alive is that even though I dropped out of this very university, yes, I'm a University of Pittsburgh dropout. And I'm not proud of that, and Mom was definitely not proud of that. She was able to see me get a honorary doctorate degree from the Chicago Theological Seminary for the work, my activist work and my work using my music to connect to movements that inspire social justice. I didn't have to be known. I didn't have to be a celebrity. I didn't have to be an actor. I didn't have to be a child of some famous activist. I just had to respond. These 3 women, Patrice, Alicia, and Opal, were known activists in their own community. But after George Zimmerman was found not guilty for the murder of Trayvon Martin, they wanted to do something. They wanted to begin a conversation about the humanity of black people, and they started the hashtag Black Lives Matter. And 2 years later, when Michael Brown was unjustly killed by a police department in Ferguson, Missouri, people began to use that hashtag, and now the movement that sprung out of the Ferguson uprising and that is dealing with all of these issues of police brutality and oppression all over this country is now labeled the Black Lives Matter movement, a response. Tarana Burke was a longtime activist in places like Selma and Philadelphia, working and mentoring young women of color, and she was trying to find out how to begin a conversation with them because so many of them that she were mentoring and experienced and ran into were victims of sexually abuse. So Tarana coined the phrase Me Too. And last year, in the wake of the many Hollywood scandals, Alyssa Milano tweeted out Me Too, and the hashtag went viral, and it began a conversation with women all over the country sharing their experience of sexual harassment and sexual abuse, and now the halls of Hollywood and corporate America are shaking now. It was a response. A few months ago, we didn't know the students in Parkland until they, unfortunately experienced a tragedy, another senseless school shooting. And it would have been natural just to go back and have a mourning period and go back to class and deal with what they were dealing with. But they wanted to respond. They wanted to start a national conversation around gun laws, gun violence, and gun reform. And in little over a month, we're able to bring hundreds of thousands of people to Washington, D.C. to march for our lives, a response. So now I do want to say this to the people of color and those labeled as other. It's not fair that most of the burden is all on us. It shouldn't be all on us to deal with racism and oppression and bigotry and bias. It should be a shared thing, right? We all should be wanting to stop it. And I know that if we dealt with and responded to every microaggression we faced on an everyday basis, if you was a student at the University of Pittsburgh, you probably wouldn't have time to do all your work. I understand that. But there's some things that I would say are unacceptable. Like the fact that there's a hall here at the University of Pittsburgh that's actually named after the man that oversaw the Tuskegee experiment, that actually infected hundreds of poor black men and left other poor black men that were infected by syphilis untreated for 40 years. So for the students and those activists that organized to change the name of Parent Hall, thank you, thank you, thank you for your response. So to those people of color and those labeled others, I would ask you to organize, speak out, push back, do something, say something. You just might find your life's purpose.